Hello lovelies, my name is Eric and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're tuning back in, I'm sorry I've been gone for a little while. The intention is always to do 2 videos a week, but it doesn't always happen. Which I think is a perfect setting for today's conversation, where we're talking about things that we aim to do but don't always get done. I'm doing this video sort of as a video response to the Pagan Perspective. The main host did the topic of frequency of practice, which I thought was very interesting. And I've sort of been thinking about like religious devotion broadly and things like that. So I sort of wanted to film this video and sort of have that conversation. We are here in the beautiful Bunyaville Reserve. We have a new baby Leo at my house, so I thought I would get out of the house and film here instead. Now, when we think about religious devotion, I think the problem is that when we think about religious, quite often what we have in our minds is Christianity, and things that look like Christianity. And when we think about a daily practice within those systems, we might be thinking about things like prayer, daily scripture reading, we might think about, going to church every week. And I sort of thought about this, and I was sort of thinking about the texts that were written in the 60s and the 70s by practicing initiated Wiccans. And like the topics that they're talking about, the focus that they have is on group work. It's on the esbats, the sabbats. It's not a focus on a daily practice, because Wicca is not something that was designed to be practiced alone initially. It was something that was done in a group. And so we see, like, there are definitely groups that practice, weekly or however regularly, but it's not something that's really practical to be set up as something that's done every day. But it did make me think about, like, how do we live within our religious belief? In what ways do we show that devotion? And I did a talk recently about altars and how, like, in Wicca, the altar is not a permanent thing necessarily, but something that moves with the temple or the circle. And so I sort of started thinking, like, well, having a home altar isn't necessarily something that would be considered part of that religious devotion necessarily. For me, I definitely do aim to have a daily practice, and I think maybe that's influenced a bit by Aleister Crowley and his writings. Of course, his expectations of what you should do every day are, like, huge, and, completely unachievable for me. I'd need an extra day to fit them all in. But it was really interesting to read what he had to say and the ideas of what he wanted people to do every day to sort of hone their abilities and practice their craft. So for me, I think the thing that I try to do every day is meditation. And I just boil that down to 30 breaths every day, and I don't always get that done. Sometimes my mood takes over, or I prioritize other things, or spend too long on Facebook or whatever, and I don't always do it. Other things do come up. Nobody's perfect, right? And I would be skeptical of anybody who said that they have maintained their daily practice for, any large length of time, because I just think, in this modern world, we're so distracted and have so many distractions, that it really does take a large amount of effort to have that dedication and that devotion to having a daily practice. That said, I do not think that you necessarily need a daily practice to be religious or to be spiritual, and it does kind of bring up that idea about orthodoxy versus orthopraxy as well, which the Pagan Perspective also covered recently. And I think that, like, in those sort of 60s, 70s Wicca texts, right practice did not include daily practice. It wasn't considered part of that orthopraxy. I definitely think that the daily practice that we see in the modern witchcraft movement is definitely influenced by other systems and other magical traditions. So I think that it's definitely something that's sort of been included as Wicca's progressed, because to me it was definitely originally more focused on that group work and coming together for the esbats and the sabbats and things like that. It made me think as well about the charge of the goddess, whenever you have need of anything, and once a month, better it be when the moon is full. So like that instruction there is like you don't need a daily practice, you should only be practicing at least once a month. Or maybe even at most once a month, depending on how you interpret that part of the charge. Of course, this is just like me reading and like making assumptions. Like, I'm not part of that group, I'm not an initiate of that system, so I'm not entirely sure if, within the oral aspects of the tradition, if there is recommendation for daily practice, which there may be, or the practicing of powers, who's to say. Well, I guess initiates, maybe, I should say. And if anybody would like to comment with your thoughts, I would absolutely love to hear what you would have to say. I guess I've had to think as well about whether or not the work that I do is considered part of my practice or part of my devotion. Like, when I'm making wands for other people, is that still part of my devotion practice? Is that still part of my religious practice? Or because it's for somebody else, is it no longer, like, devotional from me? Now, I do have a daily practice, but the more I got to thinking about it, the more I realized that it was actually pretty secular. Like, most of the things that I do or try to do every day are to manage my mental health. So things like meditation and journaling are my main foci for my daily practice. And although journaling tends to happen like once a week, and I sometimes skip a day with the meditation, but that's always the goal, is to meditate and journal every day. And that's more about me like sitting with myself and just being quiet and like listening to my own thoughts and churning my own thoughts and tasting out ideas and all these sorts of things. It's not about religious devotion per se. Sometimes I make it about religious devotion or connecting with the spirit or whatever it is. But quite often it's just me sitting down and shutting the hell up for a minute, and actually being with myself and being with my thoughts. So it's more of like a self-love, sort of self-reflection practice than it is anything to do with my devotion to gods or my relationships with spirits. It's got more to do with me than it does with anything external. And I guess, if you are under the belief that, you are your own god, then, that might totally be a thing that's worthwhile for you from a religious standing. But it made me think, like, I'm not so sure that my daily practice that I have had for this time is inherently spiritual. I think it's very secular, the things that I'm doing, and it has much more to do with my psychology than my spirituality. So yeah, it's been a very interesting thing for me to think about and to sort of reflect on, is this idea of a daily practice, because I'm not so sure that my daily practice that I have thought of as spiritual is necessarily so. But I'd love to know what you guys think. What is your practice? How often do you practice? And what does your daily practice look like? And is it a spiritual one, or does it have more to do with like psychology and, self-love and things like that? So yeah, I think that's all that I really wanted to say at this point, which is how I seem to end all my videos. So I hope that you guys are well and that this has been somewhat informative, or at the very least entertaining, and I hope that you're all well. Mwah. Bye.